Hello, team, and welcome to my part two video of the news. This is an ATP geopolitics video, a Ukraine war news update. There was so much content to give you today, I had to split it into two. If you just look at the tabs for military aid, I have at the top of my screen there, and then you add geopolitical stuff to that. It's going to take some time to go through, so that's why I split it. Sorry, not sorry. Right. There's a NATO summit going on in Vilnius right now, and as you can imagine, that is producing an awful lot to talk about and an awful lot of clamoring to support Ukraine. Some shenanigans, political shenanigans going on in terms of rhetoric and whether people are happy or unhappy with the roadmap that either is or isn't being laid out for Ukraine for joining the NATO, for joining NATO. But before we get there, let's look at military aid that has been promised or delivered. Amanda Sloat, the senior director of the National Security Council in Europe, noted that US President Joe Biden and NATO leaders unanimously approved a substantial new aid package for Ukraine. Don't know what that is, but that's going to be interesting. There's more to say about the US in a wee while. I talked about this yesterday. Norway has increased the size of its military aid fund for Ukraine from $240 million to $930 million. So that's basically, going from quarter of a million to a billion. Sorry, a quarter of a billion to a billion. So that's a huge increase from Norway there. Quite what that is going to be, we're not sure, but that is massive. I mean, part of this might be some small reconnaissance drones. So, Norwegian Ministry of Defence has announced the transfer of 1,000 Black Hornet small reconnaissance drones to Ukraine. As you can see, these are not big, but then that means that they are more difficult to take out, right? I don't know what the range of these are. I might have to look into the Black Hornet drone. Ukraine and Sweden have signed an agreement on cooperation in the field of defence procurement. Quote, this document provides great opportunities both for our armed forces and for Swedish companies like Saab and others, Alexei Reznikov has said. So this is a time where you get all these people meeting, allowing them to do, bilateral agreements amongst a number of nations to do deals with regard to provision of weaponry, humanitarian aid, financial support. So much will be taking place at this NATO summit that it's, as you can imagine, quite hard to keep tabs on. Although I'm keeping rather a lot of tabs on it. Ukraine, quote, Ukraine and France signed an agreement to increase military aid by 170 million euros. The procedure for purchasing and supplying weapons will be simplified, as well as a base for joint production of spare parts and maintenance of foreign weapons will be created. So France have been increasingly coming to the fore. I think long gone are the days where Macron was trying to position himself as the mediator between the two. He's basically pretty much gone, yeah, we ain't going to negotiate, are we really? Putin is a bit too far gone for that. So let's go all in. We don't always know what France does. It is one of the biggest global exporters of arms, probably number two now that Russia will have dropped out. It was at number three. So France is a massive military power and massive military producer, like defense equipment producer. And so it is in a really good position to be able to help Ukraine and still gets quite a lot of hassle for not helping enough. But actually, there are probably things happening behind the scenes that we just don't know about because that's the way the French operate. You quite often see stuff in Ukraine, and you're like, oh, they've given that. I was looking at some of the rifled mortars yesterday that the Ukrainians are using. Those are French mortars, not particularly shouted about, but they've got them there and they're using them, and they have greater range and I think accuracy for their rifled. They're the only, I think, rifled mortar. But anyway, I digress. So that's really good. UK has announced new military aid for Ukraine. It includes more than 70 combat and logistic vehicles, thousands of rounds of ammunition for Challenger 2 tanks, and £50 million, so $64.7 million support package for equipment repair. It also includes, not mentioned there, is pretty important, is it includes a rehabilitation center that they're going to set up. There's a really good military rehabilitation center, I think, in Birmingham in the UK. And a lot of people are saying, why aren't there Ukrainian soldiers, taken to there? I don't know. That could be happening. So I think the UK are probably in quite a good position to be able to set up something like that in Ukraine. Not to say they don't already have provision like that in places, but I think a lot of that money will be going towards a rehabilitation center for injured soldiers. Britain is handed now. This is long overdue as far as I'm concerned. Britain's handed BAE Systems, BAES.L, the country's biggest defence company, a £280 million, $361 million order for munitions. Now, there's been this ramping up of munitions over the last, well, pretty much year for nations supporting Ukraine, but oddly, the British haven't done that. There's been a lot of big talk from the British and a lot of sending equipment or buying equipment, but actually absent from that conversation has been talk about ramping up domestic production of munitions. Now, every other country seems to be doing this. Why not Britain? And this seems to be well behind the curve, but very welcome, of course. I just don't know why it took so long, unless it's one of these things where it's been announced now, but actually they've been doing it for ages. But I don't think that's been happening. I think they were waiting for the contract. Defense manufacturers are companies at the end of the day that are interested in profit, right? So they're not going to be, we're going to make loads of munitions just in case we get an order for them because we think Ukraine should get them. That's not how you operate a business that is interested in profit. That might be a moral thing to do, but it ain't going to pay your staff. So they're seeking to ramp up production to replenish stockpiles, their own stockpiles, UK stockpiles, and ensure supply for Ukraine. Obviously, those two things are intrinsically linked. We'll go on to production of artillery. I've got a thread that I'm going to share with you. It's partly why this video had to be split, because it's going to be longer. France will be transferring long-range missiles. I talked about this yesterday to Ukraine to support the counteroffensive. French President Macron confirmed yesterday. Those are they're basically the Storm Shadow missiles, but the French versions are made by the same company. They have a range of up to 300 kilometers, but I don't know whether they can change the inhibitors on that to allow them to go further, but nonetheless, that will give them the range to take out anything in occupied territories. That is significant. They would talk about 50 of these being given. There are estimates that Ukraine has used 40 to 50 of the Storm Shadow, the UK ones, so far. I don't know how long they've been using, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 months, I don't know. But actually, so 50 is not insignificant, of course. That would tally the amount that they've used already, and they've done some significant damage with the Storm Shadow cruise missiles. So that is really good news. I don't know whether that will be with a view to continuing to supply these past those 50 and maybe ramp up production of them. I know that they don't have a massive supply of these. They have used some in the Middle East with the French aircraft there. So yeah, that is really good news from good news from France, from Macron. Germans have pledged new equipment as part of coming out of this whole NATO summit. Part of their package, which is I think $700 million worth of stuff. 2 Patriot SAM launchers, not the batteries, but 2 launchers that can be just plugged onto, I guess, batteries. I don't think you could keep them too far away because they still need those parts of the command and control there. I don't think I know they've got this whole overarching centralized command system now that can piece together all of these disparate air defense systems, but I don't know that you could just whack a launcher, say for example, take one Patriot launcher and whack it on a Zaporizhia front line away from all the other bits and pieces. I don't think you can do that, but I'd be interested to know if anyone has any information on that. I think that there would be needed to be placed near the battery, existing batteries. So 25 Leopard 1 A5 main battle tanks, that's going to be really useful. Yeah, they're not the newest tanks, but they are going to be comparable to some of the T family tanks, and if they've got better optics and fire control systems on board, then that gives them a competitive advantage. 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles. These are decent pieces of kit. 40 of them will be super useful to sort of go alongside Bradleys and CV90s from Sweden. 5 Berger Panzer II armored recovery vehicles, super useful for towing away damaged vehicles and clearing blocked areas. So that's great news. The more of those, actually, the better. More of anything, the better, I guess. 20,000 155mm artillery rounds, super useful. Although that probably amounts to just 2 or 3 days worth of firing. 5,000 155mm smoke rounds and lunar reconnaissance drones. I don't know how many. I don't really know about those drones, but that is great from Germany, again, coming out of this NATO summit. And Italy, this is not anything new pledge, but just to say it has been delivered now, around 40 M109L self-propelled guns. These are part of the huge package of guns they're going to get. So 40 of them have been delivered now. There's some problem with getting them up to spec, and they had to be taken from Italian storage to then be brought up to, as I say, up to working order. But there were some issues with the contractors doing that. I believe, I don't know if it's an American contractor that was, there was a bit of controversy over them not doing a good enough job on that. So that's why I think some of those might have been delayed. 45 Iveco VM90 tactical vehicles. So they're always going to be useful. Those kind of logistics type vehicles or tactic. I talked about the Rochelle vehicles, the Canadian vehicles that they've had 550 delivered already. There will be 1,000 by the end of the year. That is an interesting story behind that company. The Canadian company is actually, I think, owned by a Israeli Canadian who's married to a Ukrainian, and they employ quite a lot of Ukrainian staff. There's quite a big diaspora community of Ukrainians in Canada. And it's based on the Ford chassis. I forget, is it Ford F whatever? Initially designed to be secure vehicles for moving money, banks and whatnot, moving money around like that, and the armored vehicles, but then have been co-opted to use for the military. So they aren't vehicles that you'd send to the front line, but they are vehicles you'd use to transport troops around behind the lines, and decent bits of kit for that job. So it's really great that Canada is supplying all of those. It seems that a few people are confused by the total pledged number of Marder 1A3 infantry fighting vehicles and Leopard 105 main battle tanks by Germany to Ukraine. Hopefully this clears up any questions. Right, Marder IFVs, 40 have been delivered already. 20 more were announced in May. 40 announced now. That is 100 in total. Obviously, not all there now. Another 60 to come. So that's the 40 I just mentioned in the ones that were announced yesterday of these extra announced now. So yeah, part of 60 more to go. Leopard 1A5s, 80 until the end of 2023, 30 in 2024, announced in May, 25 announced now. So that's 135 in total. So those 25 just announced now, I would imagine, aren't going to get to Ukraine till after May. Till 2024. Okay, that's not like they've got 25 and they can ship them out now. In fact, we do have some news. Is it here? Yeah, there's been some delay on some of these 105. So delays in the delivery of the refurbished turrets for the Leopard 105s has meant that there was not a sufficient number of tanks available at the start of the first training. And it also caused a little delay in the first deliveries of the Leopard 105s to Ukraine. So those new Leopard 105s that Germany have announced will, I'm sure, be coming to Ukraine at a later date. But like I've said before, that's not such a problem. What you want is a continual supply of this, because Ukraine can't indigenously produce numbers of tanks at anything like the levels they need. I think they can produce some tanks, like 3 a month or so. I don't know. So therefore, the replacement tanks that they need for tanks that get destroyed and go into long-term repair and whatnot will need to come from outside sources. So they can't, there's been a delay, they can't deliver 25 Leopard 1A5s right now, But that's not a problem because actually they've got enough tanks just at the moment for a large scale counteroffensive that is imminent. So they'll need replacement tanks continually over the next year, right? One would assume. So that is not the end of the world, right? Lot to be said about F-16s. A lot has been said in the last 24 hours. A coalition of 11 nations will start training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s in August. So August is when the training officially starts, apparently. That's according to the Danish defense minister at the NATO summit. There's a bit of confusion, and let me try and elucidate this. So training of the Ukrainian pilots will start in August at a base in Romania, says the Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov. The coalition of countries that will join the training of the Ukrainian military includes Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, Luxembourg, Norway, Poland, Romania, Sweden, and the UK. So the Netherlands will provide the F-16s fighter jets for training, is the claim here as well. And then Ukraine's foreign minister says training may start next month, so that's August, and that the first F-16 fighter jet should fly in Ukrainian skies by the end of March. So the actually, I was thinking the confusion is mine, actually. So I was thinking the training is going to start in Denmark, but it was Denmark that was announcing it first. And actually, the training will be in Romania. So actually, there's my confusion cleared up in real time. So I thought there's confusion over where the training is going to take place. It seems it's going to take place in Romania. The planes will be Dutch, and there are 11 nations who are involved in that training process. And that and the end of the process, or at least the first pilots, should be able to fly F-16s by the end of March next year in Ukraine. And what I like about that is we have quite a clear timeline as to what's going on. Now, whether things will happen sooner, whether there are secretly F-16 pilots being trained or pilots being trained on F-16, I don't know. But that's what's been announced at NATO. So that gives us some kind of clarity there. Right. South Korea sent a military transport aircraft loaded with non-lethal military aid for the armed forces of Ukraine. South Korea sent various forms of non-lethal aid to Ukraine, but so far rejected Ukraine's requests for lethal weapons. Although what they are doing is providing the US with a whole load of artillery ammunition, although they've said it can't be used for Ukraine. What it's allowed the US to do is then give all of their artillery ammunition to Ukraine. So it's backfilling the US. So it's effectively, functionally the same as South Korea giving Ukraine that ammunition. So although they don't officially give Ukraine ammunition, everyone knows what's going on. They're giving ammunition to other people who are giving their stuff to Ukraine. And that is super important, because if South Korea didn't do that, then Ukraine wouldn't get that ammunition. So that's how important South Korea doing that stuff is. Massively important. Netherlands has given Ukraine a mobile hospital that will help save the lives of our warriors, says Anton Gerashenko. They will get treatment sooner. So thank you to the Netherlands, he says. There have been a number of these kind of mobile medical centers, mobile hospital. I know that was it Radu Hosu has done fundraising in Romania and got one of those. It was actually attacked. It was targeted by the Russians, which is absolutely terrible. But there you go. Right, and there's also talk. Not only have we heard some fairly explicit talk about F-16s, there's talk about ATACMS. So these long-range missiles that everyone has been shouting about for a very long time. U.S. President Biden and his administration is considering the shipment of ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, says the New York Times. This comes after the French president announced long-range Scalp EG missiles for Ukraine at the NATO summit. This could be the final US decision regarding ATACMS. The USA, however, USA has objective reasons that it's not yet given Ukraine long-range ATACMS missiles, says Kuleba. So this is the Ukrainian foreign minister being fairly explicit here about ATACMS. So this might put a dampener on that New York Times article and people who are thinking, oh, ATACMS soon. It says, I know some reasons why the US has not yet made this decision. They are quite objective. We work with them, but the US is deciding to give us some other types of weapons. Whether that is something we haven't heard about, or whether that is, we're going to give you Patriot air defense systems and weapons. We can't give you ATACMS for this reason, that reason, that reason. You just can't do it. But we'll give you these, and we'll give you these radiation missiles, anti-radiation missiles for your airplanes, and we'll give you this and we'll give you that. We can't give you ATACMS. And it could be that Ukraine are fine with that. Like, okay, yeah, fair enough. We need everything we can get, and we understand that. The US is deciding to give us some other types of weapons. He says these are very difficult decisions, and they approve them. Kuleba noted he did not specify what the reasons were. There's been talk in the past that they just don't have enough ATACMS, that they have them, for particular needs. They need to keep them for whatever reason. They have their own strategic reserves and strategic reasons for having or needing such missiles, and it could be that actually they just can't afford to give them to Ukraine. And some argue that actually they're the wrong missiles. They can get taken out easily by air defense systems. So a lot of people talking about taking out the Kerch Bridge with ATACMS, but actually it appears that air defense is working quite well around Kerch. There's a couple of S-200s, possibly missiles that are surface to air missiles, rejigged to be used in a surface to surface mode. They probably have ballistic trajectory, which means they should be quite hard to take down, but they have been taken out by Panzer air defense systems around Kerch. So the point of saying that is that you can give ATACMS to Ukraine, but then they could just get shot out the air relatively easily, arguably, if you're going to try and attack somewhere like the Kerch Bridge. So there are objective reasons, as Kuleba says, I assume, and as a result, Ukraine might well get other weapons instead. Right. So let's have a look at this infographic. It's useful considering we are talking a lot about different aids being given. For 500 days of full-scale war, the Russian Federation against Ukraine, Estonia transferred military assistance to us for almost 60% of its defense budget. Latvia almost 50%, Lithuania more than 40%. In general, Ukraine has sent weapons, equipment, and other assistance for the army in an amount that is 15 times more than our 2022 defense budget, says Flash News. Now, this is a percentage of the defense budget, I think, at the bottom, and this is real terms what's been sent. Now, as you can see, the US is way ahead in real terms. This tells us so many interesting things, right? The US just has a load of stuff. They've sent 42.8, I guess that's million euros worth of kit, or is that billion? I don't know. Just a shed load of stuff, right? Now, that equates to 5.5% of their defense budget, which is insane. So not only are they given by far and away, there's a break here to show that actually this is not the correct scale to that number. So there's a big break there, because 42.8 would be way up above my screen there. But it still only amounts to 5.5% of their defense budget. That's how much the US spends on defense. It is insane. And so this gets down to that whole debate about, like, how much can you afford to give? How much, they can give a load of stuff because they have way more stuff. They've got like 6,000 Bradleys basically sitting in warehouses, a lot of them, or an amount of thousands of Bradleys sitting in warehouses. Some will say that actually some of them have been sold, some of them, whatever. And the same goes for tanks. The same goes for all sorts of pieces of equipment. Strikers, they just have so much. I told you a story before. My tank commander friend was telling me he was out in Iraq, in Challenger 2s, doing tank stuff, and then at the end of the Iraq conflict, and they're coming back, the Americans had so much equipment they couldn't. It was basically more hassle for them to take their equipment back to the US, so they buried a bunch of equipment. We're literally burying like mechanized equipment in the sand. Like, yeah, we can't take this back. We got too much stuff, so we're just going to bury it. So out in Iraq, there are places where there's like US military equipment just buried underground. It's just insane. So they have a load of stuff, but they're also super generous, of course. But it's understanding where that fits within defense spending, within GDP, how much money, how much worth that nation has in terms of what it produces. So as a percentage of GDP, US is something like 11th in what they are giving to Ukraine. But it's the most important because in real terms it gives the most. But when you look at places like Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, they give as a percentage of their GDP, they've given more. So they're poorer people or smaller countries giving more. But because they're smaller countries, that more doesn't equate to much in real terms, or as much in real terms, of course. So it's understanding. So you get a lot of American people saying, "Why are we giving so much? What Europe should be doing more." But in terms, when you look at the percentage of GDP, I think if you look at Europe as a whole, they've actually given more. I think so. That criticism is unfounded. However, there are certain European nations who haven't given much at all. So they do absolutely require, some criticism. And you can look at here and say, actually, have Italy given enough? They have been really supportive, but actually, is that as much as other nations? When you look at places like Spain, when you look at Greece, and so on and so forth, there are a number of nations who you're thinking, and then of course Austria and Switzerland. So my position is, hey, don't criticize anyone. All these nations giving stuff is awesome. Just if you can give more, please do so. I guess, but that's a really interesting infographic, and you can see some nations as a percentage of the defense budget is just insane amounts. But then, if you're Estonia and Latvia, you're like, well, we're next in the throwing line, so there's no point us building up our own army if the army next door is essentially doing the job. We're only ever going to be attacked. If you're in Estonia, you're like, well, we're not going to be invaded by the Chinese, right? Like, that's not going to happen. We are only ever going to be invaded by the Russians because they're next door. So we can either spend all our money on training up our forces to defend ourselves, or we can do this by proxy and give all that money to Ukraine, or at least a large amount of that money to Ukraine to do that work for us. So that is why it's in their own interest to be that generous, of course. Right, moving on, and this is a long thread I threatened you about, and this is kind of why I've already been going on 26 minutes. Goodness me, and we're still on military aid. Right, US and just 6 of the many European artillery ammo makers will ramp up to over 2.5 million 155 artillery rounds per year. For reference, this is a single country and 6 companies. There are dozens of other companies making artillery ammo that can go to Ukraine. So the ramp up will represent at least a 2.5 times combined ramp up from current levels for those companies who are already producing substantially more than they were producing pre-Russian invasion. With ramp ups, I will break down how and when they will get there, starting with the US. The US 155mm production is slated to hit a rate of 90,000 per month, or 1.08 million 155mm shells per year by 2025. This will be well over the original plan to ramp up to 40,000 per month by 2025 and 85,000 by 2028. So for the US, this represents the fastest artillery production increase since the Korean War. There's 3 main ways the US is planning to ramp up production. The first is adding shifts to all of its government-owned 155mm facilities. Many of these facilities only ran for 8 hours a day before the war, and are now beginning to run 24 hours a day every day, often moving from 1 shift to 3 shifts. The second is by building new. This is what I talk about, like working out how much money the US is spending, and it's not like taking money from the US and throwing it at Ukraine, like taking money out of a vault, like X billion dollars, and then walking across the world and then dumping it in Ukraine and said, here, have our money. It's like we're spending money, and here we're spending it on government facilities, employing even more people. We're increasing the shifts, getting more employment in. We are stimulating the economy. Yes, it's a defense military industrial complex, and issues with that aside, you are stimulating the economy. So we're spending money, and this will get us a return on investment. And that money will be spent by those employees in the local area. The supply companies to these companies will get the knock on. And actually, this is a money multiplier. And that's really important to recognize. The second is by building new plants. Again, stimulus. uh, and upgrading its existing facilities. This takes different forms, like creating new production lines and increasing automation. So far, the US has issued billions of dollars in contracts to modernize facilities and fund increased production, and it's giving you all the evidence for this. As noted in the incomplete production investment list above, this even includes expanding a metal parts production line in Canada, as well as opening a new plant in Texas with up to 2 to 4 more completely new plants also coming online in the future, existing government plants below. Uh, and last, to meet the 2025 ramp up timeline, the United States has tapped private industry to build their own shells at their own facilities. This is something that's not normally done, as the government plants run by private industry have been easily meeting US demand prior to now. Here's a transcript on the Army's website talking about how the Army will use both private production and government owned contractor operated plants to scale up the 155mm production. The speaker is Douglas B. Rush, United States Assistant Secretary to the Army for Acquisition. There it gives you the spiel to support that. And here are some of the large contracts from the US that the US have issued so far for production. A $994 million contract for American Ordnance LLC ended up winning after 522.3 million worth of orders went out prior to that, and then another smaller but large contract went out to GDOTS after that. Now we get to some European ammo production. There's a lot of other ammo producers besides these, but so far I've been unable to find figures and timelines. Rheinmetall currently producing 450,000 155mm rounds per year since they acquired the Spanish ammo maker Expal. This then will hit 600,000 shells next year. With its ramp up. Here, CNN article is citing the Rheinmetall CEO Armin Papager. Note, some capacity comes from existing slack, but the vast majority of this increase comes from their purchase of ammo giant Expal and the beginning of production for the new plant in Australia just this year. That's capable of making up to 100,000 shells per year. CSG, the Czech group, 100,000 plus now. Can make 100,000 now plus and will ramp up to over 150,000 per year, according to the CEO. And that was from an interview in 2022. Saab ramping up to 400,000 plus shells annually by early 2025. BAE Systems, listed at tens of thousands currently, likely around 30 to 40,000, will ramp up to 250 to 300,000 annually with a contract to increase production by 8 times. And that, we just saw today that the contract seems to be signed now. So Bosch, that's now going to come online. Polish concern PGZ Desamet revealed its current production at Defence 24 per day was up to 30 to 40,000. I don't know. No, that's not per day. Was up to 30 to 40,000 annually, likely around 50,000 now, and will ramp up to 200,000. So, right. Not quite sure. There's a bit of confusion there, but it will ramp up to 200,000 annually. It will run at least until 2029 under the current funding. And the last of the manufacturers I'll be talking about in this thread is Nammo. They started out producing 10 to 20,000 per year pre-war and will ramp up to 200,000 per year. So it's a massive increase, but will take much longer to do so than the rest of the other companies, doing so by 2028. So this is really significant, of course. No, almost all of this production will be online by 2025. Nammo appears to be the only manufacturer who will take significantly longer to ramp up. It's also important to remember Ukraine is getting ammo from tons of other countries and companies besides these as well. And this is a fraction of the overall pie. I'll be doing more threads on this later, taking a more comprehensive view as I'm able to get more data. Also note that 100% of the ammo produced by every company will go to Ukraine. This is one of the many more threads I'll do on artillery production. I look forward to that. So that's really, really, really bleeding significant. So some were talking recently about how the whole trajectory of this war will be determined by artillery production. And Russia just don't have that. They won't be able to compete with the rest of the world coming together in this way. Now, there's going to be a lot of, I'm sure, talk about supply of the chemicals needed to make these explosives, and that will be in short supply, I would have thought, going forward. I don't know whether that new Norwegian discovery that will help like battery and solar power also has explosive chemicals in that haul. I don't know, uh, but this is really good news for Ukraine, and much more challenging news for Russia, because I don't think that they are able to compete so much. Right, now going on to NATO itself and geopolitical stuff. This is basically the most important comment that has been made by Jens Stoltenberg. This has been made. If Ukraine does not win, there's no point in discussing joining NATO. It's really important to remember that. Like, everyone can argue about whether Ukraine get to join NATO here, then have this roadmap, whatever. But if they don't win the war, it's all pointless. The whole thing's pointless. So the more important thing is to talk about getting Ukraine the stuff they need to win the war. That's more important. It's just worth remembering that. Ukraine will receive an invitation to NATO when, quote, all allies agree and the conditions are met, Secretary General Stoltenberg said. A support package was approved, which provides for the cancellation of the requirement to fulfill the map regarding membership. So they're making it easier to join, so the route for Ukraine will be easier. A long-term military aid program of $500 million per year for the modernization of the Ukrainian army and full transition to NATO standards. Launch of the Ukraine NATO Council, and the first meeting will be held tomorrow with the participation of Zelensky. So there's a Ukraine NATO Council. So that, yeah, you're not going to join now. Of course, you're not going to join now, but we've got this council set up. There won't be map, but there will be some conditions which I don't name. Aren't they meant to be conditions? Yeah, so it's kind of making new conditions, but particularly tailored for Ukraine. So the final communique of the NATO summit will not invite Ukraine to become a NATO member. It says that the alliance will extend an invitation when allies agree and conditions are met. Our source in Vilnius says debates were heated, but changing the wording was impossible. So Zelensky was pretty annoyed about not being given a really clear roadmap, and was pretty angry on Twitter yesterday. And I did talk about that in my previous video. He said this morning, on the agenda today are new weapon packages and the invitation to NATO. We want to be on the same page with everyone and fight the security guarantees on the way to NATO, Zelensky said before going inside, where he's met. He's probably finished by now, but he's initially meeting with Justin Trudeau of Canada. The first issue today is weapons for our soldiers. So this is really significant. I mean, again, it's back to, Stoltenberg saying, look, if they don't win, it's all pointless. So weapons is kind of like really important. In my opinion, Duda, the Polish number one, said, this decision is absolutely not enough. I hope that in a few years, Ukraine will become a full member of NATO. He emphasized that Ukraine's accession would be a significant boost for Poland, as well as for NATO in general. So it's in his or the Polish best interest that Ukraine accede to NATO. Shashank Joshi of The Economist says, Ben Wallace, who's the UK Minister, Secretary for Defence, asked about conditions for Ukraine on NATO, said what people missed about yesterday as a communique is that there is now complete consensus that Ukraine will join NATO. Culturally, that is accepted. When that happens is conditions based. It's about when and not if. And actually, that's really important. It's not that they aren't going to join NATO. Everyone is in agreement. Well, we'll come to look at Hungary in a second. Wallace asked whether NATO conditions give Russia incentive to keep the war going. Quote, Ukraine is advancing every day. There is precious little Russian reserve available. Everyone underestimated Ukraine from day one, and that continues. Adds that Ukraine hasn't committed their reserves. And he says some of the deep strikes we've seen in open source have significantly impacted Russian ammunition. It goes back to the ammunition reserves, stockpiles, and production capacity of the Russians. Right, on to Orban. A video statement of Orban urging for peace talks, stop supplying weapons to Ukraine and training Ukrainian soldiers, but instead improving the defensive capabilities of its own member states. In other words, NATO shouldn't be bothering to support Ukraine, but should be talking about defending its own member states and sorting out its own forces. What is the point of NATO, you plonker? Like, NATO, its raison d'etre is is this kind of existential battle, this decades-long battle against the Soviet Union, as was, and now Russia. And so, if if you're not going to help Ukraine, then you're not doing what NATO was set out to do. It's just, yeah, Orban, no. Members of the US delegation at the NATO summit in Vilnius were furious with Zelensky's tweet. So this is some rumors coming out yesterday, according to Washington Post. An official familiar with the situation, classic phrase there. Zelensky's tweet obviously rubbed some people up the wrong way. However, sometimes you've got to do that to show, because you feel strong, you're indignant, you are being strong for your own country, right? And for your own, sending out your own needs. But sometimes you've got to rub people up to annoy them, to get them to do stuff. Maybe, I don't know if it was ill-advised for Zelensky to sound off yesterday, or whether actually that will enable him to more likely get his own way, or something approaching his own way. So I guess we will see. This meme, I did like this meme. Is a good old meme. Finland gets into NATO. Yeah, Sweden gets into NATO, helped up by Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine's just left there. But guys, what about me? Don't leave me here. I think that is one of my favourite the memes that just sums up so much. It's like, without the whole Ukraine war, Finland and Sweden wouldn't be in NATO. So without Ukraine, they wouldn't be in NATO. And now it's left kind of hanging. Or is it? I mean, that's the question, right? But I just kind of like that meme. Right. As a result of Sweden getting into, or looking like it's going to get accession to NATO, and Finland obviously getting that, Russia have been really pissed off. Putin and spokespeople have been evidently not happy, and they're blaming Turkey. And they've come out and said, like, so Russia's chief of the Committee on Defense and Security says that Turkey is turning from a neutral country into an unfriendly one. And people are pointing out quite clearly that it was never neutral. Right, so delivering 35 plus Bayraktar TB2s, these are drones worth millions, TRLG 230 multiple launch rocket systems, so HIMARS equivalents, 200 BMC Kirpi MRAPs, so MRAPs that we've seen have been used on the front line. We've seen damaged ones, destroyed ones. They are being used frequently by the Ukrainians, and 100,000 155mm artillery rounds still counts as being neutral. But releasing 5 Azov commanders makes you unfriendly. So this is in response to not the NATO positioning, but also Turkey allowing those Azov commanders to come back with Zelensky on the flight the other day, and that really annoyed Russia. It's like, you're turning from a neutral country into an unfriendly country. It's like, dude, I mean, you do realize what we've given Ukraine over time. Yes, we may be laundering your money, but hey, we like speaking out of both sides of our mouth. Right? If you want to launder your money in our country, go for it, because that's going to give us, that's inward investment. From my point of view, moral positioning, I would say Turkey are wrong to do that, as in they are wrong to be supporting Russia with hydrocarbon, with that kind of money situation, with Russian tourism, so on and so forth. That is bad. But from a Turkish point of view, purely, if you take morality out of it, and purely from their own kind of political and economic gain, they are playing that quite well as far as Turkey are concerned. Again, it's not to say I agree with that. And I just thought I'd leave you today with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican senator for Georgia, who has this to say in trying to get a bill into Congress. It won't.
This is paying around 4% of our GDP to defend NATO countries. The United States has been financing and promising to defend NATO countries for decades and paying more than its fair share. Western European countries could and should be stepping up their financial contributions to ensure the security of NATO.
They literally are.
Instead, they are entirely beholden to Russia, and the U.S. taxpayer is expected to foot the bill.
No, they're not. I mean, that is changing. Literally, go and look at the stats that I've just shown you. Look at some European nations. She's lumping all European nations in one. And there's a whole variety of what people are spending on defense and on NATO and in helping Ukraine. and that therefore that is simplistic and disingenuous.
Amendment number 110 prohibits the provision of F-16 fighter jets.
I love the fact that a bunch of people stand up and just leave here, but also just listen to what she's saying. So she's asking for the prohibition of F-16s
to Ukraine. My amendment would prohibit the U.S. from sending F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Providing F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine will not only deplete our own fighter fleet, but it will escalate the proxy war with Russia, which is a nuclear power, rather than implementing diplomatic solutions.
So basically, if you're a nuclear power, you can do anything you like, and no one should do anything because you got nuclear. So that just gives permission for any nuclear power to go around the world and do what they like.
Again, we should not be funding war. We should be pushing for peace. Amendment number 113 prohibits the provision of long-range missiles
So she's now going to seek to prohibit the supply of ATACMS
to Ukraine. My amendment prohibits the U.S. from sending long-range missiles to Ukraine. America.
So there you go, so on and so forth. You get the point. Those Republicans in my threads seem to be pretty reasonable Republicans, and I'm sure you would agree that hopefully she's fringe. Hopefully that will never see the light of day, really, politically speaking, those amendments. And hopefully she's not representative. Hopefully you all agree she's just a bit of a numpty. Anyway, that is a very long second video giving you news for today. Goodness me, there's a lot of content that's going to be coming out today. Sorry if it's too much, but it is just a big day and it kind of did demand this. Thank you so much for your support. Take care. Speak to you soon.